Hey guys, tonight we're searching for something that doesn't exist. A palace so grand, so ambitious, so obscenely expensive that Henry VIII bankrupted his treasury to build it, and then it vanished. Before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. All right, get comfortable. We're going on a search for something that was supposed to last forever and didn't even make it 2 centuries. Let's go. In 1538, Henry VIII commissioned the most ambitious palace England had ever seen. But no one ever saw it. Not the way he intended anyway. He tore down an entire village to build it, hired craftsmen from across Europe, spent a fortune that could have funded multiple wars. He wanted a palace so magnificent that it would make every other monarch in Europe weep with envy. He named it Nonsuch, as in, there is no such thing. Nothing like it exists that could compare. And he was right, but not in the way he thought. Because within 150 years of its construction, Henry's masterpiece was gone. Demolished, stripped for parts, sold off piece by piece, until nothing remained but faint marks in the earth and a few sketches that make you wonder if it ever existed at all. The greatest palace England had ever seen. Built by a king who could have anything. And now, you can't even find the front door. So tonight, we're going hunting. We're searching for a palace that doesn't exist anymore. A monument to ego that became a monument to impermanence. A building so ambitious that its own ambition killed it. We're talking about plasterwork so detailed it took Italian masters years to complete. Gardens that covered acres. Towers topped with golden onion domes that glittered in the sun like something out of a fairy tale. Rooms filled with tapestries, paintings and furniture that cost more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. And then we're talking about how all of it, every carved panel, every gilt surface, every stone, was ripped apart and sold by a king's mistress who needed cash. This isn't a story about architecture, it's a story about obsession, about a king who was rotting from the inside out, whose leg oozed pus daily, whose body had ballooned to the point where he needed machinery to move him upstairs. A king who knew he was dying and decided that if his body couldn't last, his legacy would. Except it didn't. So let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about why Henry VIII, a man who already owned dozens of palaces, decided he needed one more. One that would cost a fortune. One that would destroy an entire village. One that would consume the last decade of his life. And let's talk about the man who made him do it. Not a rival, not an enemy, but someone worse, a friend. By 1538, Henry VIII was a wreck. Let's be clear about that from the start. This wasn't the Golden Prince who dazzled Europe in his youth. That Henry, the one who stood 6 feet 2, who jousted and danced and played the lute, who wrote love poems and had a 32-inch waist, was long gone. At 47 years old, Henry was enormous. His waist measured 54 inches. His armour had to be specially made, reinforced, expanded every few years as his body swelled. He couldn't walk without help. Stairs were torture. Moving from room to room required servants and often mechanical assistants. And his leg. Oh God, his leg. In 1536, during a jousting tournament, Henry had been thrown from his horse. The horse, a massive war animal in full armour, fell on top of him. Henry was unconscious for 2 hours. When he woke up, he had a head injury that probably caused brain damage, personality changes, mood swings, paranoia. But worse was his leg. The impact had created an ulcer on his thigh, a wound that refused to heal. In fact, it got worse. The ulcer became infected. It oozed constantly, pus and blood soaking through bandages daily. Imagine the smell. Rotting flesh, infection, and Henry couldn't do anything about it. 16th century medicine had no antibiotics, no real understanding of infection. The best doctors in England could offer were poultices made from herbs, prayers, and the hope that God would intervene. Sometimes the wound would close up, and that was worse, because when it closed, the infection had nowhere to go. It would build up inside, causing fevers, delirium, and pain so intense that Henry would scream. His doctors would have to reopen the wound, let it drain, and start the cycle all over again. This went on for years, for the rest of his life. Henry lived in constant pain, constant fear that the infection would spread, that he'd develop gangrene, that his leg would have to be amputated, which, in the 16th century, was basically a death sentence. So Henry was dying, slowly, painfully, and he knew it. His body was betraying him. His wives kept disappointing him. Catherine of Aragon, divorced, exiled, dead. Anne Boleyn, beheaded on charges of adultery and treason. Charges that were almost certainly fabricated because Henry wanted her gone, and she'd failed to give him a son. Jane Seymour finally gave him a son, Edward, and then died 12 days later from childbed fever. Now he was married to Anne of Cleves, a marriage arranged for political alliance with Protestant German states. Henry had never met her before the wedding. He'd only seen a portrait painted by Hans Holbein the Younger. A portrait that, according to Henry, lied. When Anne arrived in England, Henry was disgusted. He called her a Flanders mare, said she was ugly, smelled bad, had bad skin. Whether this was true, or whether Henry was just a cruel, bloated tyrant looking for an excuse to reject another wife, we'll never know. The marriage lasted 6 months. Henry had it annulled. Anne wisely didn't fight it. She accepted a generous settlement, a few castles, and the title of the king's beloved sister. She outlived Henry by 10 years, and by all accounts lived quite happily without him. But in 1538, all of this was swirling around Henry. His body was failing. His marriages were disasters. His son was sickly. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were considered illegitimate, barred from succession. And across the Channel, Francis I of France was thriving. Francis I. Let's talk about Francis, because you cannot understand what drove Henry to build this palace without understanding his obsession with Francis. The two men had been rivals since they were young, both born in the 1490s. Both became kings in their teens. Both were tall, handsome, athletic. Both loved tournaments, music, art, women. Both saw themselves as the greatest king in Europe. They were mirrors, reflections, and they hated each other with the kind of hatred that only comes from seeing your own ambition reflected back at you. In 1520, the two kings met at an event designed to cement peace between England and France. It was held in northern France, near Calais, in a field that had been transformed into a temporary city of tents, pavilions, and stages. It became known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold, because everything, and I mean everything, was covered in gold fabric, gold thread, gold embroidery, gold leaf. It was obscene. Thousands of people attended. Both kings brought their entire courts, nobles, knights, servants, musicians, cooks, entertainers. There were feasts that lasted days, courses upon courses, swan, peacock, venison, boar, pies filled with live birds that flew out when you cut them open, subtleties, elaborate sugar sculptures depicting castles, ships, mythological scenes, wine flowing constantly, beer, mead, everyone drunk, everyone competing. There were tournaments, knights in full armour jousting, sword fighting, archery contests. Both kings participated, both desperately wanted to win, to prove physical superiority, to show the other up in front of thousands of witnesses. Henry was good, very good. He'd been training since childhood, but Francis was better, taller, stronger, more experienced, and everyone could see it. The tension built, day after day, every interaction dripping with false politeness and real competition. Who had the better tent? Whose pavilion was more impressive? whose horses were finer. And then, on one of the final days, Henry made a catastrophic mistake. He challenged Francis to a wrestling match. It wasn't planned. Not part of the official events, just Henry, drunk on wine and ego, deciding that he and Francis should wrestle, right there, in front of everyone. Francis agreed. Because of course he did. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. A chance to humiliate Henry physically, publicly. They grappled. Two kings wrestling in the dirt like common brawlers, and within moments, Francis had Henry pinned. On his back, in the mud, defeated. The crowd went silent. This wasn't supposed to happen. Kings didn't lose, especially not in front of thousands of witnesses. Henry got up, brushed himself off, laughed it off, pretended it didn't matter, but everyone knew it did. Everyone saw the fury in his eyes, the humiliation. Francis had won. Physically, publicly, definitively. And Henry would never forget it. Never forgive it. For the rest of his life, that moment haunted him. The moment Francis proved he was stronger. But the humiliation didn't end there. Because after the Field of the Cloth of Gold, Francis went home and built Fontainebleau. Fontainebleau was Francis's revenge. His way of proving that he wasn't just physically superior, he was culturally superior too. Francis hired the best Italian artists, Rosso Fiorentino, Francesco Primaticcio, Giovanni Battista, masters of the Italian Renaissance. They created frescoes covering entire walls, stucco work so detailed it looked like carved marble, paintings depicting classical myths, French history, Francis himself as various heroes. The Gallery of Francis I was the showpiece, a long corridor, almost 200 feet, covered in wood panelling carved with Francis's salamander emblem, interspersed with elaborate frescoes, scenes of gods, battles, allegories, everything gilded, everything excessive. There were apartments decorated with painted ceilings, ballrooms with parquet floors, gardens with fountains and grottos, a chapel with stained glass windows, everything designed to say, Francis is a Renaissance prince. Francis understands art. Francis is cultured. And Henry had nothing like it. Henry had Hampton Court, but he'd stolen that from Cardinal Wolsey. He had Whitehall, but that was medieval, dark, outdated. He had Greenwich and Richmond, but those were his father's palaces, not his. Francis had built something new, something that screamed his name, something that would last centuries as proof of his greatness, and Henry couldn't stand it. The jealousy ate at him, gnawed at him daily. Every time he heard about Fontainebleau, about the new frescoes, the new gardens, the ambassadors who visited and returned breathless with praise, Henry seethed. So he decided to build something better, something that would make Fontainebleau look provincial, something so magnificent that Francis would weep with envy. He would call it Nonsuch, and to build it, he would destroy an entire village. The village of Cuddington had existed for centuries, small, quiet, unremarkable. It sat in Surrey, about 12 miles south of London, close enough to the capital to be useful, far enough to feel rural. There was a church, St. Mary's, built in the 13th century, stone walls, a bell tower, gravestones marking generations of families who'd lived and died there, farmers, labourers, people, whose names no one remembers because they weren't important enough to write down. The church had a nave, simple wooden pews, a stone altar, a rood screen separating the nave from the chancel, stained glass windows, not elaborate like cathedral glass, but coloured nonetheless, showing saints, biblical scenes, donated by families over generations. There was a font where babies had been baptised for 300 years, a pulpit where priests had delivered sermons, a stone floor worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The floor was paved with grave slabs. Important villagers buried right there under the floor, their families stepping over them every Sunday, close to God, close to the altar, closer than the poor souls buried outside in the churchyard. and there were so many buried outside. The churchyard was crowded with graves, some marked with stones, some marked with wooden crosses that had long since rotted away, some unmarked entirely, their location remembered only by the oldest villagers who'd attended the funerals decades ago. There were homes, timber-framed, thatched roofs, wattle and daub walls, woven sticks covered in mud and straw, dirt floors, small windows with no glass, just wooden shutters. The kind of houses where families slept together for warmth, where animals sometimes shared the space during winter, where disease spread fast and life was short. Maybe 60 families lived in Cuddington, maybe 70, enough to support a church, a mill, a blacksmith, a small market. There were fields, crops, strip farming, each family working their own narrow strips of land. Barley, wheat, vegetables, pigs rooting in the mud, chickens scratching in yards, cows, sheep. Enough to feed themselves and sell a little at market in Kingston or London. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Generations had lived there, been born there, married there, died there, been buried in that churchyard under St Mary's watchful stone walls. And then Henry VIII decided he wanted the land. There was no negotiation, no town meeting where Henry's representatives explained the plan and asked for input. No fair compensation, just orders. The king wants this land, you have to leave. In 1538, royal surveyors arrived in Cuddington. They measured, made notes, drew maps, marked boundaries. The villagers watched, nervous, confused, hoping this was temporary, hoping the king would change his mind, hoping someone would intervene. No one did. Orders came down. The village would be demolished. Everyone would be evicted. The church would be torn down. The graveyard would be emptied. Wait, the graveyard? Yes, the graveyard. Because Henry didn't just want the land around the church, he wanted that land too, all of it, which meant the bodies buried there, some for centuries, had to be moved. Imagine being a villager watching that happen. Watching men arrive with shovels and carts, watching them start digging, not carefully, not reverently, efficiently, quickly, because there were hundreds of graves and they had a schedule to keep. They dug up the recent graves first, bodies that had been in the ground for years, maybe decades, still recognizable as human remains. Skeletons, skulls, rib cages, leg bones, wrapped in rotting shrouds. The workers loaded them into carts, piled them, bones mixed together, grandmothers and grandfathers, children who died of fever, young mothers who died in childbirth, all jumbled together. No longer individuals, just bones. Some were taken to nearby churchyards, reburied in mass graves, blessed quickly by priests who had other villages to tend to. No individual graves, no markers, just a hole in the ground, bones dumped in, covered with earth. Some probably weren't moved at all, because the records are vague. The orders were clear, relocate the graves, but enforcement was lax. Some workers probably took shortcuts, dumped bones in the woods, buried them in unmarked pits on the edges of the property, or just left them, scattered, forgotten. And then there were the older graves, graves from the 14th century, 13th century, bodies that had been in the ground for 200, 300 years. Nothing left but fragments, bits of skull, teeth, long bones crumbling into dust. No one bothered relocating those. They were just removed, shoveled aside, mixed with the dirt, spread across the fields where Henry's palace would rise. So when workers later dug foundations for the palace, they were digging through human remains, building on top of them, mixing them into mortar, crushing them under stone. The village itself was next. Families were given days to pack up their lives, days to figure out where they'd go, what they'd do, how they'd survive. Some probably went to nearby villages, moved in with relatives, found work as labourers. Some probably ended up in London, living in crowded tenements, working as servants, street vendors, beggars. Some probably didn't survive the transition, because moving in the 16th century wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Disease spread fast in cities. Winter killed people who didn't have shelter. Starvation was common, and Henry didn't care, didn't think about it. These people were invisible to him. Obstacles, inconveniences. The demolition crews arrived. They started with the houses, ripped off the thatched roofs, tore down the timber frames, salvaged what they could. Good timber was valuable, and burned the rest. The wattle and daub walls crumbled, mixed with the dirt, disappeared. Within weeks the homes were gone. Just empty plots where families had lived for generations. Then they demolished St. Mary's Church, started with the roof, stripped the lead, valuable, could be melted down and reused. Removed the bell, also valuable, smashed the stained glass windows, probably sold the glass to another church, or just left it in piles to be carted away later. They knocked down the walls, stone by stone. Some of the stone was reused in the palace, some was probably sold, some left in piles. The altar was removed, the font, the pulpit, the rood screen, everything stripped, everything taken, and finally, the floor. The grave slabs covering the burials inside the church, pried up, moved, the bones beneath them dug up and relocated, or not. By the end of 1538, Cuddington was gone. Completely. No church, no homes, no people, just empty fields, disturbed earth, scattered debris, and the work of building Henry's vision began. Construction began in 1538, and it was chaos from day one. Henry wanted the best, the most skilled, the most innovative craftsmen in Europe, so he hired them. Masons from England, carpenters from France, plasterers from Italy, specialists in techniques that hadn't been used in England before. He hired Nicholas Bellin of Modena, an Italian craftsman famous for his decorative plasterwork. Bellin had worked on other royal projects, Hampton Court, Whitehall. He knew how to create elaborate designs, figures, foliage, coats of arms, out of plaster, and then gild them so they shimmered like carved gold. Bellin brought a team of Italian craftsmen with him. Specialists, men who'd trained in Rome, Florence, Venice, men who knew techniques English plasterers had never seen. They arrived in Surrey and looked at the empty fields where Cuddington had been, and they got to work. The foundation was laid first, deep trenches dug, stone foundations poured. This wasn't going to be a timber building that would rot in 50 years. This was going to be permanent, stone, brick, built to last centuries. The outer court went up first, simpler, functional. This was for servants, staff, guards, the people who made the palace run, but didn't need to be impressed. But even the outer court was impressive by normal standards. 2 stories, brick with stone detailing, large windows, expensive because glass was expensive, chimneys, multiple fireplaces. This wasn't a medieval hall with a central fire pit and smoke hole. This was modern, Renaissance architecture. Then they started on the inner court, and this is where things got insane. The inner court was designed to overwhelm, to stun visitors into silence. Every surface was decorated, every wall covered in plasterwork, every tower topped with gilded details. The walls rose, brick, faced with stone, but you wouldn't see the stone for long, because once the walls were up, Bellin's team covered them. They built wooden frameworks attached to the walls. Then they applied plaster, layers and layers, each one carefully smoothed and shaped, and then they carved. While the plaster was still wet, still workable, they carved figures into it. Roman emperors, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius. Henry loved Roman history, saw himself as a new Caesar. So the walls depicted Roman triumphs, victories, power. There were gods, Jupiter, Mars, Apollo, classical mythology everywhere. Because Renaissance princes were supposed to be cultured, supposed to understand classical antiquity. There were allegorical figures, virtues, justice, temperance, fortitude, all represented as beautiful women in flowing robes. And there were scenes of Henry himself, depicted as Hercules, as Alexander the Great, as various mythical heroes, subtle as a brick to the face, Each panel took weeks to complete. The craftsmen worked slowly, carefully, because once the plaster dried, mistakes couldn't be fixed. You'd have to start over. Chip off the entire panel and begin again. And Henry visited, often, rode down from London or Hampton Court to inspect the progress, walked through the construction site, pointed at panels, demanded changes. Why doesn't that figure look more heroic? Why isn't there more gold? The workers probably hated his visits, because Henry was impatient, demanding. He wanted everything done faster, better, more impressive. But you can't rush plasterwork, can't rush gilding. These techniques required time, precision, and the craftsmen knew it. They nodded, said yes, Your Majesty, and kept working at the pace the work required. The gilding came last. Once a panel was carved and dried, craftsmen applied gold leaf. Thin sheets of actual gold, beaten so thin you could see through them, applied carefully to the raised surfaces of the carvings. The high points of faces, the folds of robes, weapons, crowns. Gold leaf is delicate, tears easily, requires steady hands and patience. You apply a thin layer of adhesive, let it dry to just the right tackiness. Then you carefully lay the gold leaf, press it down with soft brushes, trim the excess. One panel might require days of gilding, and there were hundreds of panels. The result was stunning. When sunlight hit the inner court, the walls glittered, gold catching the light, figures seeming to move, emerging from the walls like they were alive, but it was taking forever. Years. Henry had started construction in 1538. By 1542, 4 years later, the basic structure was complete. The towers were up, the courtyards were functional, but the decorative work was ongoing. The gardens were being planted. Trees don't grow overnight. You plant saplings and wait. The knot gardens were laid out, geometric patterns of low hedges, but hedges take years to mature, to grow thick enough to create the patterns properly. The fountains were installed, elaborate multi-tiered structures, water pumped from underground sources through lead pipes, carved figures spouting water from mouths, horns, shells. Beautiful, but also requiring constant maintenance. Lead pipes leaked, pumps broke, fountains stopped flowing and had to be repaired. By 1544, 6 years into construction, the palace still wasn't finished. The basic structure was there, the towers, the courtyards, some of the plasterwork, but the details, the gilding, the gardens, the interior decoration were ongoing, and Henry was running out of time. His leg was worse, the ulcer bigger, the infection spreading, the pain constant. He'd married and divorced Anne of Cleves, married and beheaded Catherine Howard, his 5th wife, executed for adultery that may or may not have actually happened. Married Catherine Parr, his 6th and final wife, who would outlive him. Henry was 53 years old, obese, in constant pain, paranoid, convinced everyone was plotting against him. There were accidents. Of course there were accidents. Construction sites in the 16th century were death traps. No safety regulations, no protective equipment. Just men working with heavy stone, dangerous tools, and rickety scaffolding. Workers fell. From scaffolds, from walls, from towers. Broke legs, broke backs, died. Their bodies were carried away. Their families compensated with a few coins, if they were lucky. And work continued. Stone-crushed fingers, hands. Men lost digits to chisels that slipped, to hammers that missed, to saws that caught. The lime used in mortar burned skin. Got in eyes, caused infections. Men went blind, disfigured. And the lead used in the roofing? Toxic. Workers who handled it daily, melting it, shaping it, installing it, slowly poisoned themselves. Lead poisoning causes tremors, confusion, organ failure, death. No one knew. No one connected the symptoms to the material. They just knew that some workers got sick and died, and they were replaced. Henry didn't care about the accidents, didn't visit the injured, didn't attend funerals. He cared about progress, about the palace, about making sure it was finished before he died. But it wouldn't be. Because in January 1547, Henry VIII died at Whitehall Palace. He'd visited a handful of times, walked through the courtyards, inspected the plasterwork, nodded approvingly at the gardens, but he never saw it finished, never got to host Francis I there, never got to watch foreign ambassadors walk through the inner court and weep with envy. Francis was already dead, died in 1547, just months before Henry. So the rivalry that had driven the palace's creation, over. Both men dead, both leaving behind incomplete legacies. And the property passed to Henry's son, Edward VI, 9 years old, bookish, pale, sickly, already coughing, already dying. Edward VI inherited more than just a palace. He inherited an entire kingdom in crisis. His father had spent decades tearing England apart, breaking with Rome, dissolving monasteries, confiscating church lands, executing anyone who disagreed with him. England was Protestant now, officially, but half the country still clung to Catholicism. Tensions were high, civil war was a constant threat. And sitting on the throne, holding all of this together, was a 9-year-old boy who'd rather read Latin texts than deal with politics. Edward didn't want the palace, didn't care about it. He was raised to be pious, scholarly, devoted to Protestant reform. He cared about theology, education, making England a truly Protestant nation. A half-finished palace in Surrey? That was his father's obsession, not his. Edward's regents, the men who actually ran the country while he was a child, felt the same way. Why pour more money into Henry's monument when there were wars to fight, religious reforms to enforce, a country to stabilise? So construction slowed. Didn't stop entirely, but slowed. Some work continued. The gardens were maintained. Some of the interior rooms were completed. But the urgency was gone. The obsession was gone. Edward visited occasionally, used it as a hunting lodge, walked through the gardens, but he didn't love it, didn't obsess over finishing it, didn't see it as the culmination of royal ambition. To Edward, it was just another palace, and he had bigger concerns, like dying. Edward was never healthy. From childhood he was frail, pale, thin. He coughed constantly, probably tuberculosis, possibly made worse by the polluted air of 16th century London, definitely made worse by the stress of being a boy king in a fractured kingdom. By 1553, Edward was clearly dying, coughing up blood, feverish, unable to eat. His doctors tried everything: bloodletting, purgatives, arsenic tonics, prayers. Nothing worked. Edward died on July 6, 1553. He was 15 years old. He'd been king for 6 years. He'd spent most of that time sick, in pain, knowing he wouldn't live long enough to marry, to have children, to secure the succession. His final months were spent writing a document, his devise for the succession, that attempted to bar his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, from the throne. He wanted his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, to inherit. Because Jane was Protestant, Mary was Catholic, and Edward couldn't bear the thought of England returning to Catholicism after his death. It didn't work. Jane Grey was queen for 9 days before Mary seized the throne. Jane was imprisoned in the Tower of London, executed the following year, 17 years old, beheaded for a crime she didn't commit. And Henry's monument passed to Mary I, Bloody Mary. Henry's eldest daughter, 37 years old, Catholic, bitter, determined to reverse everything her father and brother had done. Mary I. Let's talk about Mary, because she's often reduced to a single nickname, Bloody Mary, and that doesn't do justice to how complicated, how tragic, and how genuinely terrifying her reign was. Mary was born in 1516, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. For the first 11 years of her life, she was Princess of Wales, heir to the throne, betrothed to various European princes, educated, beloved. And then her father decided he wanted a divorce, wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, wanted a son, and Mary's entire life collapsed. Henry broke with Rome, married Anne, declared Mary illegitimate, stripped her of her title, forced her to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her infant half-sister, Elizabeth, subjected her to years of humiliation, isolation, and psychological abuse. Mary's mother, Catherine, died in 1536, possibly poisoned, possibly from cancer, definitely heartbroken. Mary wasn't allowed to see her before she died, wasn't allowed to attend the funeral. Mary clung to her Catholic faith. It was all she had. The one thing her father couldn't take from her. The one thing that connected her to her mother, to Spain, to a world where she mattered. And then after Henry died and Edward became king, Mary watched as England lurched further into Protestantism. Monasteries dissolved, Catholic rituals banned, priests executed, everything she believed in dismantled. By the time Edward died in 1553, Mary was 37, unmarried, childless, bitter, and determined to restore England to Catholicism no matter what it took. She became queen in July 1553, the first reigning queen of England in her own right. Not a queen consort, not a regent, a queen. And she immediately began undoing her father's and brother's reforms. She restored Catholic Mass, reinstated the Pope's authority, married Philip II of Spain, a powerful Catholic king, but also a man she barely knew and who had zero interest in her beyond the political alliance. And then Mary started burning Protestants. Between 1555 and 1558, Mary's government executed around 280 Protestants, burned at the stake, for heresy, for refusing to convert to Catholicism, for clinging to Protestant beliefs. Men, women, bishops, common labourers. It didn't matter. If you were Protestant and refused to recant, you burned. These weren't quiet executions. They were public. Crowds gathered, watched, some cheered, some wept. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. The screams were audible across town squares. Mary believed she was saving England's soul, believed that by burning heretics, she was purging the country of sin, that she was doing God's work. To Protestants, she was a monster, a tyrant, Bloody Mary, a nickname that would stick for centuries. And in the middle of all this, the burnings, the religious chaos, the political instability, Mary used the palace. She loved it, or at least she loved hunting, and Henry's creation had excellent hunting grounds. Deer, boar, birds, acres of forest and field. Mary spent time there, held court, entertained her husband, Philip, though he was barely in England. He spent most of their marriage in Spain or the Netherlands, left Mary alone, pining, desperate for a child that would never come. Mary believed she was pregnant multiple times. Her belly swelled. She stopped menstruating, felt movement, all signs of pregnancy. She made public announcements, prepared nurseries, commissioned cradles, had baby clothes made, but nothing happened. Months passed. No baby. Doctors quietly admitted there was no pregnancy, probably phantom pregnancies caused by stress and desperation, possibly ovarian cysts or tumours causing her belly to swell. Mary was humiliated, devastated. She knew what it meant. No child, no Catholic heir. The throne would pass to her Protestant half-sister, Elizabeth. Everything she'd fought for would be undone the moment she died, and she was dying. By 1558, Mary was sick, feverish, in pain, probably ovarian cancer, possibly influenza, definitely heartbroken. She spent some of her final months there, walking through the gardens, hunting when she had the strength, trying to enjoy the palace her father had built, the palace that was supposed to last forever. She rode through the grounds, watched the deer, sat in the inner courts surrounded by those gilded panels depicting Roman emperors and classical gods. Did she see the irony? Her father depicted as Hercules, as Caesar, as a hero, when in reality he'd destroyed her life, destroyed her mother, destroyed so many people. Mary died on November 17th, 1558. She was 42 years old, childless, bitter, knowing that everything she'd done, the burnings, the religious reforms, the marriage to Philip, would be reversed the moment Elizabeth became queen. And what Henry built passed to Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the Protestant princess, the woman Mary had tried to keep from the throne. Elizabeth would use it more than anyone, would love it, would make it famous, would turn it into a symbol of her reign, but she wouldn't finish it either. Elizabeth I loved the palace, more than her father, more than her brother, more than her sister. Elizabeth saw what it could be, not just a palace, a stage. Elizabeth was 25 when she became queen in November 1558, young, clever, a survivor. She'd spent years navigating the treacherous politics of her father's and siblings' reigns. She'd been declared illegitimate, imprisoned in the Tower of London on suspicion of treason during Mary's reign. She'd learned early that survival required caution, intelligence, and the ability to play the game better than anyone else. And Elizabeth was very, very good at the game. One of her strategies was spectacle. Elizabeth understood that monarchy was theatre, that a queen needed to be seen, needed to dazzle, needed to create an image so compelling that people would remember her forever. Henry's creation was perfect for this. The palace her father had built to outdo Francis I, the palace that screamed wealth, power, culture. Elizabeth used it constantly. She held court there, entertained foreign ambassadors, hosted hunting parties, threw elaborate banquets, used the gardens for outdoor performances, plays, music, dancing. When foreign ambassadors visited, Elizabeth made sure they saw everything. The inner court with its gilded panels, the gardens with their fountains and mazes, the hunting grounds stocked with deer, everything designed to impress, to intimidate, to send them home with stories about England's wealth and power. The Venetian ambassador visited in 1559 wrote back to Venice describing it as a fairy palace, said the plasterwork looked like it had been carved from marble, said the gilt panels glittered so brightly in the sun you couldn't look at them directly. The French ambassador visited in 1564 wrote that it surpassed Fontainebleau, that Francis I's palace looked provincial by comparison. Whether he believed it or was just being diplomatic, who knows? But Elizabeth made sure the comparison spread, made sure everyone heard that Henry's vision had won, that he'd finally beaten Francis, except Francis was dead. Henry was dead, and the rivalry that had driven its creation was over. But Elizabeth kept it alive, used it, made it part of her mythology. She invited courtiers to stay for weeks at a time, made it a destination, a place where the most important, most ambitious people in England gathered, where alliances were made, where marriages were arranged, where power was negotiated over wine and venison. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, spent a lot of time there. He was Elizabeth's favourite, the man she probably loved more than any other. Tall, handsome, ambitious, they'd known each other since childhood. Some say they were lovers, some say Elizabeth wanted to marry him but couldn't because he was already married. And then his wife died, Amy Robsart, found dead at the bottom of a staircase in 1560, broken neck. Officially, an accident. Unofficially, everyone whispered murder, that Dudley had killed her so he could marry Elizabeth. Elizabeth couldn't marry him after that. The scandal would have destroyed her, so Dudley remained her favourite, her companion, but never her husband. They spent time together there, rode through the gardens, hunted, sat by the fountains. Elizabeth relaxed in a way she couldn't at court, could be less formal, less guarded. Poets visited. Edmund Spenser, who wrote The Fairy Queen, that epic poem celebrating Elizabeth as Gloriana. He walked through the inner court, saw those classical scenes, those allegorical figures, and wove them into his poetry. Elizabeth as a goddess, as a mythical queen, as something more than human. That was Elizabeth's genius. She understood mythology, understood that if she controlled her image carefully enough, she could become legendary, not just a queen, a symbol. And the palace helped, because it was mythological itself, larger than life, covered in gods and heroes, a fairy palace, a place that didn't quite feel real. Elizabeth held masks there, elaborate theatrical performances where courtiers dressed as mythological figures played out allegories of virtue defeating vice, of England triumphing over her enemies, all staged in the gardens, under the stars. With music and dancing and costumes that cost fortunes, she hosted hunting parties, not just for sport, for politics. Hunting was where deals were made, where ambassadors could be approached informally, where Elizabeth could assess loyalty, gauge ambition, reward favourites. She gave gifts to courtiers, land, titles, access, and she did it there, made the palace synonymous with royal favour. But Elizabeth didn't finish it, didn't pour money into completing the endless details, because Elizabeth was pragmatic. She knew that money spent on gilt panels was money not spent on ships, on soldiers, on spies, on the intelligence network that kept her informed of every plot, every rebellion, every threat. And there were threats, constantly. Catholic nobles who believed Elizabeth was illegitimate, who believed Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin, a Catholic with a claim to the English throne, should be queen instead. Spain. King Philip II, Mary I's widowed husband, who considered Elizabeth a heretic, who was building an armada, planning an invasion. Elizabeth couldn't afford to waste money on vanity projects, so Henry's monument stayed in its perpetual state of almost finished. Beautiful, impressive, but incomplete. Still, Elizabeth loved it. She visited often, more than any other monarch. She walked through the gardens in the evenings, sat by the fountains, read in the inner court, wrote letters, made decisions that shaped England while sitting in rooms her father had built. By the time Elizabeth died in March 1603, at 69 years old, the palace was still beautiful, still impressive, but aging, incomplete, a monument to her father's ambition and her own pragmatic neglect. The gilt was tarnishing, the plasterwork cracking, the gardens required constant maintenance, hedges had to be trimmed, fountains repaired, paths cleared. And it passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. A new dynasty, the Stuarts, a king who had no connection to Henry VIII, no nostalgia for his vision. James used it occasionally, but he didn't love it, didn't care about maintaining it. He had his own palaces, his own priorities, and what Henry built began its slow decline. James I didn't particularly care about the palace. He visited occasionally, used it for hunting. James loved hunting, loved it obsessively, would spend entire days chasing deer while his government floundered without him. But it wasn't special to James. It was just another property, another palace in a collection of palaces he'd inherited when he became King of England in 1603. James had bigger concerns. He was trying to unite England and Scotland, two countries that had spent centuries at war. He was trying to navigate religious tensions between Protestants and Catholics. He was trying to manage Parliament, which was becoming increasingly difficult to control. And he was spending money, constantly, extravagantly, on favourites, on banquets, on his court. James's spending was legendary. He gave away titles, lands, and money to courtiers he liked, especially male courtiers, especially attractive male courtiers. James's sexuality has been debated for centuries. He had a wife, Anne of Denmark, and children, but he also had intensely close relationships with male favourites, Robert Carr, George Villiers, who became the Duke of Buckingham. Relationships that involved love letters, jealousy, and enough physical affection that contemporaries whispered. Whether James was bisexual, gay, or just extremely affectionate with male friends in a way that looks romantic to modern eyes, We'll never know for certain, but we do know he spent a fortune on these favourites, gave them estates, titles, money, power. The palace wasn't a priority, so it decayed, slowly. The gardens grew wild, the fountain stopped working, no one maintained the mechanisms, water stopped flowing. The basins filled with leaves and debris, algae grew, the plasterwork continued to crack. Rain seeped through the roofs, damp spread through the walls. Mould grew in corners, the gilt flaked off. What had once glittered now looked dull, tarnished. The mazes overgrew. Hedges that were supposed to be trimmed into neat geometric shapes became wild thickets. You could still walk through them technically, but they didn't look intentional anymore. Didn't look like art, just looked neglected. James died in 1625, 58 years old, probably from dysentery, possibly from kidney failure, definitely after years of declining health. The property passed to his son, Charles I, and Charles had even less interest in maintaining it. Charles I was trying to rule without parliament, trying to impose religious uniformity, trying to raise money through increasingly unpopular taxes. He was heading toward a confrontation with his own people, a confrontation that would end with civil war. In 1642, England exploded into civil war, royalists versus parliamentarians, king versus commons, traditional monarchy versus a new vision of government where parliament held real power. It was brutal. Families divided, brothers fighting brothers, towns besieged, battles fought across England, thousands dead. And what Henry built? It became a military asset. Not a palace, a strategic location. Both sides wanted it. The royalists held it first, used it as a base. Soldiers camped in the courtyards, slept in the rooms, used the inner court, that beautiful gilded space Henry had built, as a barracks. They carved their names into the plasterwork. Soldiers bored between battles, defacing centuries-old craftsmanship. Crude initials, dates, drawings, all scratched into panels that had taken weeks to create. They lit fires in rooms that weren't designed for them. Needed warmth, didn't care that the smoke blackened the ceilings, damaged the wood panelling, created fire hazards. They stabled horses in the ground floor rooms, horses that kicked, that urinated, that damaged floors and walls, the smell of horse piss soaking into stone and wood. Then the parliamentarians seized it, kicked out the royalists. Did the same things. More soldiers, more damage, more neglect. Soldiers ripped down tapestries, sold them, used them as blankets, tore them into pieces for bandages. They stole anything valuable that could be carried. Candlesticks, plates, furniture, paintings, anything not nailed down disappeared. They used the gardens for military drills, trampled the flower beds, dug latrines, ruined decades of careful cultivation. Henry's monument was being destroyed, not deliberately, just through neglect and military necessity. No one cared about preserving it. It was just a building, a resource, nothing special. In 1649, the war ended. Charles I was tried for treason, found guilty, and on January 30th, 1649, he was beheaded in front of Whitehall Palace. The first English king to be executed by his own people. England became a commonwealth. No king, no monarchy, just a government led by Parliament, and increasingly by one man, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was a Puritan, devout, strict, convinced that England needed to be purged of sin, excess, and anything that smacked of Catholic ritual or royal indulgence. Palaces were symbols of royal excess. Cromwell didn't want them, didn't need them. So Henry's creation, along with many other royal properties, was seized by the Commonwealth. And then, nothing. It sat empty. No court, no hunting parties, no maintenance, just an empty palace, slowly rotting. The plasterwork crumbled, entire panels fell off walls, crashed to the floor, broke into pieces. No one cleaned them up. They just lay there, mixed with debris, ground into dust, the gilt tarnished and flaked off. What little gold remained lost its luster, turned brown, green, oxidized. The gardens overgrew completely. The mazes became impenetrable thickets. The fountains filled with algae and debris. The ponds stagnated, became breeding grounds for mosquitoes. The orchards turned wild, trees unpruned, fruit rotting on branches, falling, fermenting on the ground. Roofs collapsed, rain poured into rooms, damp spread, mold grew, wood rotted, stone cracked. The windows, those expensive glass windows, were smashed, either by vandals or by wind or by the sheer pressure of decaying frames. Glass littered the floors, dangerous, sharp. No one cleaned it up. Henry's dream was dying, and no one cared. The Commonwealth needed money. Wars were expensive. Governing was expensive. So they started selling off royal properties, lands, palaces, anything that could be liquidated. It should have been sold then. Should have been demolished in the 1650s. But it wasn't. It just sat there, empty, forgotten, decaying. And then in 1660, everything changed. The monarchy was restored. Charles II, son of the executed king, returned from exile and became king. The restoration was supposed to fix everything, bring back stability, bring back culture, bring back the glory of the English monarchy. But Charles II had a problem. He needed money. The treasury was empty, and he had debts, lots of debts, to people who'd supported him during exile, to governments that had harboured him. So Charles started giving away property, royal estates, titles, land, anything he could use to pay his debts or reward loyalty. And in 1670, he gave what remained of Henry's vision to his mistress, Barbara Villiers, the Countess of Castlemaine. Barbara Villiers was not subtle. She was beautiful, ambitious, and ruthlessly practical. She'd been Charles's mistress since the early days of his reign. She'd borne him at least 5 children, maybe 6, depending on which historians you trust. She'd been showered with gifts, titles, money, land. But Barbara was expensive. She spent lavishly on clothes, jewellery, gambling. She lost fortunes at cards, thousands of pounds in single nights, bought estates, lived like royalty herself, and by 1670, she was running out of money. Charles was pulling away. He had younger mistresses now, including Nell Gwyn, an actress who was charming and funny, and not nearly as expensive as Barbara. Barbara needed cash, and Charles gave her the palace, not as a gift to enjoy, as a gift to liquidate. Barbara looked at what remained, this crumbling, half-ruined palace that had been rotting for decades, and saw an opportunity. The building itself was worthless, but the materials, those were valuable, so she demolished it, sold it, piece by piece. Let's talk about what Barbara Villiers did, because this is where the story gets darkly practical, ruthlessly efficient. The death of a palace, conducted like a business transaction. Barbara didn't tear it down out of spite. She didn't hate the palace, she just needed money. And by 1670, it was more valuable as salvage than as a building. The palace had been neglected for decades. The Civil War, the Commonwealth, even after the Restoration, no one had maintained it. It was falling apart, roofs leaking, walls cracked, plasterwork crumbling. But the materials, those were still good. Stone, lead, timber, carved panels, glass. All of it could be reused, all of it could be sold. So Barbara hired demolition crews, men who specialised in taking buildings apart, not wrecking them, carefully dismantling them, salvaging everything that had value. They started with the roof. Lead roofing was expensive, heavy, valuable. It could be melted down and reused, or sold by weight. The crews stripped the lead from the roofs, rolled it up, loaded it onto carts, weighed it, sold it to buyers who would melt it down for other projects. Church roofs, plumbing, coffins, then the timber, the wooden beams that supported the roofs, the carved panelling that covered walls, the coffered ceilings. All of it was removed. Carefully, because good timber was valuable, could be reused, Some of it was sold to builders, men constructing houses in London, in Surrey, who needed beams, floorboards, panelling. They didn't care where it came from, just that it was good quality and cheaper than new timber. Some probably ended up in other houses, recycled, installed in homes across the region. So somewhere in Surrey there might be houses built in the late 17th century that contained timber from the palace. Beams holding up ceilings, panelling covering walls. No one knows for sure. No one marked it. The stone was next. The walls were dismantled block by block. Stone was always valuable, could be used for foundations, walls, fireplaces. Buyers came from miles around. Farmers building new barns, landowners expanding their estates, parish churches needing repairs. They purchased cartloads of stone, hauled it away in wagons, used it in their own construction projects. So again, somewhere in Surrey, there are buildings, houses, churches, barns that contain stone from Henry's palace, and no one knows which ones. The glass windows, rare and expensive in the 17th century, were carefully removed, pane by pane. Glass was too valuable to smash. It was sold to glaziers. Who sold it to churches, manor houses? Anyone who could afford it. Even the plasterwork, the elaborate panels that Nicholas Bellin and his Italian craftsmen had spent years creating, was stripped off. Some of it probably crumbled during removal. Plaster doesn't survive rough handling. It cracks, crumbles, turns to dust. But some pieces might have survived intact, might have been sold to collectors, to nobles who wanted classical decorations for their homes. Where those pieces ended up, if they survived at all, no one knows. The demolition took years, not because the building was hard to take apart, but because Barbara was methodical. She wanted to extract every ounce of value. Didn't rush, didn't waste. She hired agents to manage the sale, to find buyers, to negotiate prices, to ensure maximum profit. And the gardens? Those were sold off separately. The land was valuable. Close to London, good soil. Barbara sold parcels to farmers, to developers, men who would clear the ornamental gardens and plant crops. The orchards were cut down, the trees sold for firewood or timber, the fountains were dismantled, the lead piping salvaged and sold, the stone basins broken up and sold, the sculptures, if any survived, sold to collectors or destroyed. The mazes were cleared, hedges ripped out, the land levelled, turned into fields, the ponds were filled in, dirt dumped until they disappeared, the land reclaimed. By 1682, 12 years after Barbara started, what Henry had built was almost completely gone. The towers were down, the courtyards were rubble, the gardens were fields. By 1690, 20 years after Barbara started, it was gone, completely. Nothing left but foundations buried under earth. And even some of those were dug up and sold. Where did the materials go? We don't know exactly, but here's what's likely. Some of the stone probably ended up in houses in nearby villages. If you wander around Surrey today, there are old houses, 17th and 18th century, that might contain stone from the palace. No one knows for sure. No one marked it. No one kept records of which stones came from which demolished building. Some of the timber probably burned in fireplaces, or rotted in barns, or was repurposed so many times that its origin was forgotten. A beam from Henry's vision might be holding up a ceiling in a farmhouse, might be part of a door, might have been used to build a fence that rotted away centuries ago. The lead might be anywhere, melted down, reformed, reused a dozen times over the centuries. Could be in church roofs, in plumbing, in weights, in ammunition. Lead is infinitely recyclable. So the lead from those roofs could still exist, somewhere, in some form, completely unrecognisable. And the plasterwork, those beautiful, elaborate panels that Henry had commissioned to rival anything in Europe, probably destroyed. Plaster doesn't survive rough handling. It cracks, crumbles, turns to dust. A few fragments survived, we know because archaeologists found them in the 1950s. But the rest, gone, crushed, mixed with rubble, Buried, forgotten, Barbara made a fortune, enough to pay her debts, enough to keep living extravagantly, enough to maintain her lifestyle for years. She outlived Charles II. He died in 1685, probably from kidney failure, possibly from poisoning, definitely after a lifetime of excess. Barbara lived until 1709, 68 years old, long enough to see multiple monarchs come and go, long enough to become a relic herself, a reminder of a more decadent era, and what Henry built, forgotten. The land where it once stood was turned into farmland, ploughed, planted, harvested, season after season, year after year, decade after decade. Then in the 18th century, a new house was built on part of the site, called Nonsuch Mansion, but it had nothing to do with the original palace. It was just a name, a ghost, a reference to something that used to be there, something most people had forgotten. For centuries, people forgot. The palace became a legend, a story old people told. Did it really exist? Was it as magnificent as they said? Or was it exaggerated? A myth? Because there was nothing left. No ruins, no romantic crumbling walls covered in ivy. Just fields, farmland, and eventually a park. In the 19th century, the land was turned into a public park, Nonsuch Park. Green fields, walking paths, woods, a pleasant place for picnics and afternoon strolls. And almost no one knew that beneath their feet were the remains of the most ambitious palace England had ever seen. Until 1959, when archaeologists decided to find out if the stories were true. In 1959, a team of archaeologists from London began excavating Nonsuch Park. They had historical records, descriptions, a few drawings. They knew approximately where the palace had stood. But no one knew what, if anything, remained. Barbara Villiers had been thorough. Centuries had passed. The land had been ploughed, built on, walked over, erased. But archaeology is patient, persistent. The team began digging, carefully, mapping, documenting, looking for foundations, for anything that proved the palace had really existed. And they found it. Not much, but enough. They found the foundations of the inner court, stone bases where walls had stood, the footprint of the palace. The dimensions matched the historical descriptions exactly. 2 courtyards, octagonal towers at the corners, just like the record said. They found fragments of tile, pieces of plasterwork, small, broken, but recognizable. Carved details that matched the descriptions in historical records. Fragments showing classical figures, flowing robes, faces. Proof that yes, the plasterwork had been real, had been as elaborate as people claimed. They found evidence of the gardens, traces of paths, foundations of fountains, stone bases where the elaborate multi-tiered structures had stood, post holes where fences or trellises had been installed, evidence of planting beds. They found debris, broken pottery, glass shards, animal bones, from feasts, from kitchens, from the daily life of the palace, oyster shells, wine bottle fragments, evidence of the lavish lifestyle that had once filled the courtyards. They found pieces of lead piping, remnants of the water system that had supplied the fountains, corroded, broken, but identifiable. They found fragments of window glass, small pieces, some still coloured, evidence of the expensive glazing that had filled the windows. It wasn't much. The palace was gone. But these fragments, these tiny pieces, proved it had existed, that the stories weren't exaggerated, that it had been real. The excavation continued through the early 1960s. The team mapped the entire site, drew reconstructions, compared their findings to historical descriptions. They used a painting by Joris Hoefnagel from 1568, that famous image showing the palace in its prime, compared it to the foundations they'd uncovered, and it matched. The layout, the proportions, the positioning of the towers, everything lined up. What they learned was both fascinating and frustrating. It had been exactly where the record said. The layout matched the descriptions. The scale was correct, everything lined up. But the details, the things that made it special, the plasterwork, the gilt, the carvings, the fountains, those were gone. Lost when Barbara Villiers sold everything piece by piece. The archaeologists found fragments, enough to know what the plasterwork had looked like, enough to confirm that yes, there had been carved figures, gilded surfaces, elaborate decorations, but not enough to recreate them, not enough to rebuild, just enough to know what we'd lost. They also found something unexpected. Beneath the foundations, they found traces of Cuddington, the village Henry had destroyed to build his palace. Post holes from houses, fragments of medieval pottery, the outline of the church, St. Mary's, the graveyard, evidence of burials that had been disturbed when construction began. The village hadn't been completely erased. Parts of it remained, buried, forgotten. But there, a ghost beneath a ghost, the archaeologists carefully excavated, documented, and then filled everything back in. Because there was nothing to preserve, no standing walls, no structures, just foundations, and those needed to be protected by burying them again. Today, if you visit Nonsuch Park, there's nothing to see. The excavations were filled in, the land restored, grass planted, trees allowed to grow. There's a small plaque near the car park, easy to miss. It says something like, "Site of Nonsuch Palace, 1538-1682. A few sentences about Henry VIII, about its destruction. There are a few information boards scattered through the park, with drawings of what it looked like, descriptions of the gardens, brief histories. But the palace itself? Gone, completely. You can stand where Henry walked, where Elizabeth held court, where Barbara Villiers decided a palace was worth more as salvage than as history, and you'll see grass, trees, people walking dogs, families having picnics, joggers, cyclists, children playing. No hint that this was once the site of the most ambitious palace England had ever seen. If you know where to look, you can see slight depressions in the ground, places where the courtyards were, where walls stood, but you'd never notice unless someone pointed them out. It doesn't exist, not in any meaningful way, not as ruins, not as a monument, just as a name, a story, a memory preserved in drawings and descriptions and archaeological reports. But here's the thing, its absence makes it more powerful, more legendary, because we can imagine it. We can picture the gilt panels glittering in the sun, the fountains flowing, the gardens in full bloom, Elizabeth walking through the courtyards in her elaborate gowns, courtiers trailing behind her, Henry inspecting the plasterwork, nodding with satisfaction, believing this palace would stand forever. We can imagine it. And because we can only imagine it, because it doesn't exist for us to walk through and touch and photograph, it remains perfect, unchanged, eternal. Not as a building, but as an idea, a dream, a monument to ambition that paradoxically survives by not surviving. If it still existed, it would just be another palace, another tourist attraction, another building you walk through while half listening to an audio guide. You'd see the faded gilt, the cracked plaster, the wear and tear of 500 years, and it would be impressive, but also disappointing, because reality never quite matches imagination. But because it's gone, because it was destroyed, because we only have fragments and paintings and descriptions, it's legendary, it's mythical, it's the palace that doesn't exist. And maybe that's better than existing. Maybe being a ghost is more powerful than being real. So what does this teach us? What's the lesson of a palace that doesn't exist? Maybe it's about impermanence. Henry VIII spent a fortune, bankrupted his treasury, destroyed a village, poured years into construction, and it didn't matter. The palace didn't last, didn't become the eternal monument he wanted. Within 150 years, it was rubble. Within 300, it was forgotten, nothing. Lasts, not buildings, not monuments, not even the most carefully planned, most expensively constructed symbols of power. Stone crumbles, wood rots, metal corrodes, everything decays, everything falls apart, and no amount of money or power or ambition can change that. Or maybe it's about ego. Henry built it to prove something, to outdo Francis, to show Europe that England, that he was superior, to create a legacy that would outlive him. But the legacy isn't what he intended. We don't remember it as proof of Henry's greatness. We remember it as proof of his excess, his obsession, his inability to recognize that no amount of guilt plaster could change who he was. A dying king desperately trying to prove he still mattered. And in the end, Francis is remembered for Fontainebleau, which still stands. Henry is remembered for beheading wives. The palace is just a footnote, a curiosity, something that doesn't exist. Or maybe it's about how we value things. Barbara Villiers looked at it and saw salvage, materials, money. She didn't see history, didn't see art, didn't see Henry's dream or Elizabeth's theatre. She saw lead roofing that could be sold by weight, timber that could be repurposed, stone that had value because it could be used again. And maybe she was right. Maybe a palace that no one was using, that was falling apart, that cost money to maintain. Maybe that was more valuable as raw materials than as a monument. It's a brutal calculation, but it's honest, and it's a reminder that history doesn't preserve itself. Someone has to care enough to maintain it, to protect it, to argue that it's worth more intact than dismantled. No one argued for it, so it died. Or maybe the lesson is simpler. Maybe this teaches us that sometimes the most interesting things are the ones that no longer exist. The gaps in history, the things we've lost. We have Windsor Castle, Hampton Court, the Tower of London. Buildings that have survived for centuries. We can visit them, walk through them, touch the walls, stand in the rooms. They're impressive, but they're also known, documented, photographed. We can see exactly what they are. This we can only imagine, and imagination is powerful, more powerful than any physical building, because imagination isn't limited by reality, by decay, by the disappointing gap between what we hope something was and what it actually is. By not existing, it gets to remain perfect, gets to remain the most ambitious palace England ever saw, gets to remain impossible. And maybe that's the greatest monument Henry could have built. Not a building, but a mystery, a story that survives because it's incomplete, because we're still searching for it, still trying to understand it, still wondering what it really looked like, what it felt like to walk through those courtyards, what Henry was thinking when he stood in that inner court, surrounded by gilt panels, believing he'd finally proven himself. We'll never know, because it's gone, but we'll keep searching anyway. Keep imagining, keep telling the story of the palace that doesn't exist, because some things are more powerful as ghosts than they ever were as buildings. Thanks for staying with me tonight. If you made it this far, drop a comment and let me know. Had you heard of Nonsuch Palace before? Does knowing it's gone make you want to see it more? Does it feel more real or less real now that you know it doesn't exist? And if you want more stories like this, stories about the things history lost, the gaps and ghosts and mysteries, subscribe. Because the past is full of things that don't exist anymore. And sometimes those are the most interesting stories of all. Sleep well. And remember, sometimes the things we lose become more valuable than the things we keep. Sometimes absence is more powerful than presence. Sometimes the palace that doesn't exist is the one worth searching for. Sometimes the greatest monuments are the ones that vanish, the ones that force us to imagine, the ones that live on not in stone and timber, but in stories and wonder, and the endless human need to search for things that can never be found. Nonsuch Palace doesn't exist, but tonight it did, in your imagination, in the space between what was and what's lost, and maybe that's enough. Good night.